Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. Nothing happened that night. I want to be very clear about that from the start. I went to bed at my usual time, pulled the covers up to my chin, and slept peacefully until morning. There was no disturbance, no interruption to my routine. I didn't see anything unusual, and I certainly didn't experience anything that would warrant discussion or concern. The thing is, I remember being perfectly comfortable in my bed. The mattress felt normal beneath me, the pillow cool against my cheek. I was wearing my blue pajamas, the ones with the small tear near the left shoulder that I keep meaning to fix. My feet were warm under the blanket, and I could hear the familiar hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Everything was exactly as it should have been. I didn't leave my bed that night. I'm certain of this because I remember the feeling of the sheets against my skin, the way they bunched up around my ankles like they always do. I didn't get up to use the bathroom, didn't go to the kitchen for water, didn't walk to the window to look outside. I remained exactly where I was supposed to be, in my room under my covers, sleeping soundly. Which is why it's strange that I can describe the hallway so clearly. Not that I was in the hallway, of course. I must have glimpsed it earlier in the evening when I brushed my teeth. The carpet was that familiar beige color, maybe a shade darker than usual, though that could have been the lighting. The walls seemed closer together than I remembered, but old buildings settle, and perspective can play tricks on you when you're tired. I was very tired that night. That explains a lot of things, really. When you're exhausted, your mind can conjure all sorts of nonsense. It can make you think you're walking when you're actually lying still. It can make you believe you're seeing things that aren't there, hearing sounds that don't exist. The brain is remarkably creative when it's deprived of proper rest. The sound I thought I heard was probably just the building settling, old pipes maybe, or the heating system cycling on. It definitely wasn't footsteps, even though it had that particular rhythm that footsteps make on carpet. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause, like someone was being very careful about where they placed their feet, testing each step before committing their full weight. But that's just my imagination filling in details where none exist. I didn't open my bedroom door. I know this because I remember the door being closed when I woke up in the morning, and I always keep it closed when I sleep. The handle is one of those old brass ones that turns with a distinctive click, and I would have heard that sound if I'd touched it. I would have felt the cool metal against my palm, would have noticed how it turned more smoothly than it used to, as if someone had recently oiled the mechanism. The hallway beyond my door was dark, naturally. I didn't see it because I wasn't there, but if I had been, it would have been dark because there's no reason for lights to be on in an empty hallway in the middle of the night. The darkness would have been complete, the kind that makes you blink to make sure your eyes are actually open. Though there might have been a faint glow coming from somewhere, maybe the exit sign at the far end, casting everything in that peculiar green tint that makes familiar objects look foreign. I definitely didn't walk down that hallway. My feet never touched that carpet, never felt how it seemed slightly damp, as if someone had spilled something and not quite cleaned it up properly. I didn't notice how the air grew thicker with each step, how it seemed to press against my skin like warm water. I wasn't there to smell that metallic scent that could have been old radiators or could have been something else entirely. The elevator at the end of the hall wasn't working anyway. It's been broken for weeks, though I suppose that's not entirely accurate. It moves, but it doesn't go where you expect it to. Sometimes it stops between floors, sometimes it skips floors entirely. The maintenance company keeps saying they'll fix it, but these things take time. I wouldn't have pressed the call button because I knew it wouldn't come, and I certainly wouldn't have been surprised when the doors opened immediately, as if it had been waiting. I didn't step inside because I wasn't there, but if I had been, I would have noticed how the interior was different from what I remembered. The walls were a soft blue color instead of the usual beige, and they seemed to curve slightly, as if the elevator car was round instead of square. The floor felt spongy underfoot, not like the usual industrial carpeting, but something organic, something that gave way slightly when you shifted your weight. There were no buttons on the wall where buttons should have been, just smooth blue surface that was warm to the touch, even though the air inside was cold enough to make me shiver. I didn't press my hand against that wall, didn't feel how it seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat felt through skin. I wasn't there when the doors closed without any input from me, wasn't there when the elevator began to move in a direction that didn't feel like up or down. The sensation of movement was probably just vertigo from being overtired. When you're exhausted, your inner ear can play tricks on you, make you feel like you're moving when you're perfectly still. It can make you think you're traveling for a very long time, much longer than any elevator ride should take, even in a tall building. It can make you believe you're going somewhere impossible, somewhere that shouldn't exist. I didn't see the doors open onto a place I'd never been before. I wasn't there to step out onto a floor that felt different under my bare feet, softer and warmer than any building material should be. I didn't look around at walls that curved away into darkness, didn't see how they seemed to breathe slightly, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched my own pulse. The corridor I didn't walk down was wider than the hallway in my building, and the ceiling was higher, though I couldn't see where it ended. There might not have been a ceiling at all, just darkness that went up and up forever. The walls on either side were lined with doors, though they didn't look like normal doors. They were too tall, too narrow, and they had no handles or knobs that I could see. Just smooth surfaces that might have been wood or might have been something else entirely. I wasn't curious about what was behind those doors. Curiosity would have required me to actually be there, and I was safe in my bed the entire time. But if I had been curious, if I had approached one of those doors, I might have noticed how they were warm to the touch, how they seemed to hum very quietly, a sound you felt more than heard. I might have discovered that they opened at the slightest pressure, swinging inward to reveal rooms that were much larger inside than they appeared from the corridor. The first room I didn't enter was empty except for a single chair in the center. The chair was facing away from the door, toward a wall that was covered in something that might have been wallpaper but moved too much, shifting patterns that hurt to look at directly. I didn't sit in that chair, didn't feel how it adjusted itself to fit my body perfectly, didn't experience how comfortable it was despite being made of what looked like metal. I wasn't there when the wallpaper began to show images. I didn't see pictures of places I'd never been, people I'd never met, events that couldn't possibly have happened. I didn't watch as the images became more personal, more familiar, showing me things from my own life but wrong somehow, distorted in ways that made my stomach clench with recognition and revulsion. The second room I didn't visit contained nothing but mirrors, though they weren't reflecting what they should have. I didn't see myself in those mirrors, didn't see the room around me. Instead, they showed other places, other times, other versions of events I thought I remembered correctly. I didn't stand there staring, didn't feel that growing sense of uncertainty about what was real and what wasn't. I definitely didn't see myself in one of those mirrors, but different. Older, maybe, or younger, or just changed in ways I couldn't quite identify. I didn't watch as that other version of me mouthed words I couldn't hear, didn't feel the creeping horror as I realized that other me was trying to warn me about something. I wasn't there to press my hand against the mirror, wasn't there to feel how the surface gave way like water, wasn't there when my reflection reached back. The third room was the one I didn't want to think about. It was smaller than the others, more intimate, and it smelled like my childhood home, though that was impossible. The scent was so specific, so perfect, that it made my eyes water with memories I'd thought I'd forgotten. I didn't recognize the furniture, didn't see how it was arranged exactly like my bedroom had been when I was very young, down to the stuffed animal on the bed and the book left open on the nightstand. I didn't sit on that bed, didn't feel how it was exactly the right softness, exactly the right warmth. I wasn't there when someone sat down beside me, someone I couldn't quite see when I turned to look. I didn't feel the weight of them on the mattress, didn't hear their voice speaking words that were almost familiar, almost comforting, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. They didn't tell me things about myself that I'd never told anyone. They didn't know about the thoughts I had late at night, the fears I kept buried so deep I pretended they didn't exist. They didn't speak in a voice that sounded like mine, but older, wiser, sadder. I didn't listen as they explained things about my life that I wasn't ready to understand, wasn't ready to accept. I didn't stay in that room for what felt like hours, didn't lose track of time completely as we talked about things I can't quite remember now. The conversation definitely didn't leave me feeling hollow and strange, like something had been taken out of me and something else put in its place. I wasn't different when I finally stood up to leave, wasn't carrying knowledge I didn't want and couldn't forget. The walk back to the elevator was much shorter than I remembered, though I wasn't taking that walk, so my memory of the distance is probably unreliable anyway. The doors opened before I reached them, and I stepped inside without hesitation because I wasn't actually there to hesitate. The ride back was smooth and quick, nothing like the journey down, and when the doors opened I was back on my familiar floor, in my familiar hallway. I didn't walk back to my room, didn't open my bedroom door with that distinctive click, didn't slip back under covers that were still warm from my body heat. I was already there, had been there all along, sleeping peacefully through the night. When I woke up in the morning, I was exactly where I should have been, in my own bed, in my own room, with sunlight filtering through my slightly uneven blinds. Everything was normal. My pajamas were the same ones I'd gone to sleep in, still with that small tear near the left shoulder. My feet were warm under the blankets, and I could hear the familiar hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The door to my room was closed, just as I'd left it, and when I opened it, the hallway looked exactly as it always did. Beige carpet, walls the proper distance apart, no strange dampness or metallic smell. The elevator was still broken, of course. I tried it later that morning just to check, and it didn't come when I pressed the call button. I waited for several minutes, listening to the mechanical sounds of a system that wasn't quite working properly, before giving up and taking the stairs like I always do. I've been sleeping well ever since. No disturbances, no unusual dreams, no reason to question the peaceful routine of my nights. I go to bed at the same time, wear the same pajamas, pull the covers up to my chin in the same way. Everything is exactly as it should be, exactly as it always has been. Though I have been adjusting my blinds more frequently lately, they seem to get uneven on their own, hanging just a bit crooked no matter how carefully I straighten them. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed waiting for sleep to come, I think I can hear that familiar rhythm in the hallway. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause, like someone walking very carefully, testing each step. But that's probably just the building settling. These old places make all sorts of sounds, especially at night when everything is quiet. There's no reason to think it's anything else, no reason to get up and check. I stay exactly where I am under my covers, listening to the footsteps that aren't there, waiting for the sound to reach my door. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf, where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor, and that it was never mine. But really, nothing happened that night. I want to be clear about that from the start. People ask me about it sometimes, and I always tell them the same thing. There was nothing to see, nothing at all. I was probably just tired, maybe a little stressed from work. You know how your mind can play tricks on you when you're not getting enough sleep. The bookmark was just something I'd forgotten I had, that's all. Maybe it fell from one of the books when I was cleaning. These old houses settle, things shift around. There's always a rational explanation for everything if you just think about it logically. I didn't go outside that night, I'm certain of that. I stayed in, watched some television, had a normal evening. The fact that I can remember exactly how the grass felt under my bare feet doesn't mean anything. Sometimes your brain fills in details that never happened. It's perfectly normal. The air was cool though, not that I was out in it, but if I had been, it would have been that kind of crisp coolness that makes your skin tingle. The kind where you can almost taste the moisture in the air, metallic and clean. But I was inside the whole time, so I wouldn't know about any of that. I definitely didn't hear anything unusual. The house was quiet, just the normal sounds, the refrigerator humming, the old pipes settling. If there had been that low vibration, almost like a tuning fork struck somewhere deep underground, well, that would have just been the neighbor's generator. They run it sometimes during storms, even though there wasn't a storm that night. The lights in my house worked fine, all of them. I checked every single one, not because I needed to, but just because I was being thorough. They all turned on exactly when they should have. The fact that they seemed dimmer than usual, like they were struggling against something, that was probably just old bulbs. I should have changed them months ago. I never went to the back door. There was no reason to. I always used the front entrance, and I certainly didn't stand there for 20 minutes with my hand on the doorknob, feeling how warm the metal was despite the cool night. Door handles don't just get warm by themselves, so obviously I'm misremembering something. Maybe I touched it earlier in the day when the sun was shining on it. The thing is, I know exactly what I saw when I opened that door. Not that I opened it, because I didn't, but if I had, I would have seen my backyard looking completely normal. The same fence, the same trees, the same garden shed I've been meaning to paint. Everything exactly where it should be. Except the shed looked different somehow, cleaner, like someone had pressure washed it recently, which is impossible because I haven't done that in years. And the grass around it was shorter, more uniform, like it had been cut with surgical precision. But grass doesn't grow that evenly on its own, so I must be thinking of someone else's yard, maybe something I saw on television. I closed the door immediately. Well, I would have if I had opened it, which I didn't, but the motion of closing it felt so familiar, so necessary, like I'd done it many times before. The click of the lock engaging was louder than it should have been, echoing through the house in a way that made me think of empty rooms and hollow spaces. That's when I noticed the smell, not that there was a smell because there wasn't. The air was perfectly normal, but if there had been something, it would have been like ozone after lightning, sharp and clean, but somehow wrong, like electricity running through water. I probably just had something stuck in my nose, maybe dust from cleaning earlier. I went back to the living room and sat down in my chair, the same chair I always sit in, facing the television. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The bookmark was still on the floor where I'd found it, thin and silver with markings I couldn't quite make out. Not that I tried to read them. There was no point in examining something that didn't belong to me and had no significance whatsoever. The television was off, but the screen wasn't completely dark. There was that faint glow old sets get sometimes, like they're not quite ready to let go of the last image they displayed. I could almost see shapes in that glow, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. But that's just how cathode ray tubes work. Phosphor persistence, I think they call it. I didn't turn the TV on because I wasn't really interested in watching anything. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the house around me. It was quiet, but not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful evening. This was the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like someone had carefully removed all the normal sounds and left only the essential ones. The refrigerator had stopped humming. I noticed that right away, though I tried not to think about it too much. Refrigerators cycle on and off all the time. There's nothing unusual about that. The fact that I couldn't remember ever hearing it turn off before didn't mean anything. I just hadn't been paying attention. Without the refrigerator's hum, I could hear other things more clearly. The settling of the house, the whisper of air moving through vents, the almost inaudible buzz of electricity in the walls. But underneath all of that, there was something else. A rhythm, maybe, or a pattern, like breathing, but too slow and too deep to be human. I told myself it was just the wind outside, even though the trees weren't moving when I glanced out the window. Sometimes wind can create strange effects in houses, especially older ones like mine. It gets caught in the eaves or flows through gaps in the siding in ways that can sound almost organic. The bookmark caught my eye again. It was reflecting light from somewhere, though I couldn't figure out where the light was coming from. All the lamps were off, and the television screen had finally gone completely dark. Maybe it was moonlight coming through the windows, though when I looked up, the sky was overcast. I should have picked up the bookmark and thrown it away, but something stopped me. Not fear, because there was nothing to be afraid of, just a reluctance to disturb something that had found its way into my house through perfectly normal means. It belonged to someone after all, even if that someone wasn't me. The markings on it were clearer now, though I wasn't trying to read them. They looked almost like letters, but from an alphabet I didn't recognize. The shapes were too angular, too precise, like they'd been etched by something that didn't quite understand how human writing was supposed to flow. But that was probably just my imagination filling in details that weren't really there. I decided to go to bed early. There was no point in staying up when I was obviously tired and starting to see things that weren't there. A good night's sleep would clear my head and help me think more rationally about the evening's non-events. Walking to the bedroom, I noticed that my footsteps sounded different, heavier maybe, or like they were echoing off surfaces that weren't there. The hallway felt longer than usual, though I counted the same number of steps it always took to reach my door. Sometimes fatigue can affect your perception of space and distance. I didn't look back at the living room before going into my bedroom. There was no reason to. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, and there was certainly nothing standing in the doorway watching me go. The feeling of being observed was just a common psychological phenomenon, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in a quiet house at night. My bedroom was normal, completely, utterly normal. The bed was made the way I always make it, the dresser was in its usual place, and the window showed the same view of my neighbor's house it had shown for years. If the neighbor's house looked somehow different, cleaner, more geometric, with windows that reflected light in impossible ways, well, that was just the darkness playing tricks on my eyes. I got ready for bed without turning on the lights. I knew where everything was, and the darkness felt appropriate somehow. Natural, like it was supposed to be that way. The moonlight coming through the window was enough to see by, even though there wasn't supposed to be any moonlight with all those clouds. As I lay down, I could feel the bookmark's presence in the living room. Not that objects have presence, because they don't. It was just my mind fixating on something unusual in an otherwise ordinary evening. But I could sense it there, reflecting light that didn't exist, displaying symbols that meant nothing to me. The breathing sound was clearer in the bedroom, slower and deeper than before, like whatever was making it had settled in for the night. I told myself it was the sound of my own breathing, amplified by the quiet house and my tired mind. Sometimes when you're lying very still, you become hyper-aware of your own bodily functions. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I would jerk awake with the feeling that something had changed. The room felt different each time I opened my eyes, though nothing had moved. The shadows were in the same places, the furniture hadn't shifted, and the window still showed the same impossible view of my neighbor's transformed house. Sleep came eventually, though it didn't feel like sleep. It felt more like sinking, like being drawn down into something that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light. I dreamed of standing in my backyard, looking up at a sky that was too clear and too bright, filled with stars arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the dream, the shed door was open, though I'd never seen inside it before. The interior was larger than it should have been, extending back into darkness that seemed to have depth and weight. There were things hanging from the ceiling, geometric shapes that moved with their own internal logic, casting shadows that didn't match their forms. I walked toward the shed even though I knew I shouldn't. Each step felt necessary, inevitable, like I was following a path that had been laid out long before I arrived. The grass under my feet was perfect, each blade exactly the right height and color, too uniform to be natural, but too natural to be artificial. The breathing sound was coming from inside the shed, I realized. That slow, deep rhythm I'd been hearing all evening. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't quite organic either. It was something else, something that existed in the space between those categories. I reached the doorway and looked inside, though I knew I shouldn't look. The darkness beyond was complete, but somehow illuminated, like it was its own source of light. I could see everything and nothing, understand completely while comprehending not at all. That's when I woke up, though waking up felt more like surfacing than opening my eyes. The bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, unchanged and unremarkable. The breathing sound had stopped, replaced by the familiar hum of the refrigerator cycling back on. Everything was normal again. I got up and walked to the living room, not because I needed to check on anything, but just because I was awake and restless. The bookmark was gone from the floor. I must have picked it up earlier and forgotten, though I couldn't remember doing that. Memory can be unreliable when you're tired. The television screen was dark and stayed dark when I looked at it. No phosphor glow, no shifting patterns, just the normal reflection of the room behind me. I could see myself in the black screen, standing in my pajamas like any normal person would on any normal night. But behind my reflection, I could see something else. Not clearly, just a suggestion of movement, a sense that the space behind me was occupied by something that shouldn't be there. When I turned around, the room was empty, of course, just my furniture and my belongings and the familiar comfort of home. I went back to bed and slept dreamlessly until morning. When I woke up, everything was exactly as it should be. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and my house felt like itself again. I made coffee, read the news, and started my day like any other day. I never found the bookmark, though I didn't really look for it. There was no point in searching for something that had never been important in the first place. It probably just got swept up with some other debris and thrown away. These things happen in the normal course of maintaining a house. People sometimes ask me about that night, though I'm not sure why. There's nothing to tell them because nothing happened. I was tired, I went to bed early, I had some vivid dreams. That's the extent of it. Everything else is just my imagination filling in gaps that don't need to be filled. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in my chair in the evening, I notice how quiet the house gets, how the shadows seem to settle into shapes that are almost familiar, how the air feels charged with possibilities that I choose not to explore. And sometimes I think about the bookmark wherever it is now, whether it's found its way to someone else's house, someone else's floor, whether they'll pick it up and examine those strange markings, or whether they'll be smart enough to leave it alone. Tonight feels like one of those nights again. The air has that same quality, that sense of held breath and waiting. The shadows are gathering in the corners of the room, and I can almost hear that slow, deep breathing starting up again. But I'm not going to investigate. I'm not going to look out the back door or check the shed or pay attention to any sounds that might not be there. I'm going to sit here in my chair, watch television, and have a perfectly normal evening. Because nothing happened before, and nothing is going to happen now. The bookmark on the floor beside my chair suggests otherwise. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. That's how it started, I think. These small disturbances that felt normal at the time but now seem like breadcrumbs leading to something I can't quite grasp. I've been different lately, though I struggle to define exactly how. Sleep comes in fragments. My reflection sometimes takes a half-second too long to match my movements. Food tastes slightly off, as if seasoned with something I can't identify. There's a gap in my memory. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing you'd notice right away. More like a page torn from a book so carefully that you only realize it's missing when the story stops making sense. I know something happened, but the edges are blurred, dissolving whenever I try to focus on them. The first concrete clue came when I was cleaning out old files on my phone. Buried between voice reminders about grocery lists and work meetings, I found an audio recording I didn't remember making. The timestamp meant nothing to me, but the duration was odd, 47 minutes of something I apparently thought was worth preserving. I pressed play with the volume low, expecting to hear my own voice rambling about forgotten plans or ideas. Instead, there was only ambient sound at first. The soft hum of electronics, maybe a refrigerator or air conditioning unit. Then my voice emerged, but it sounded different, distant, like I was speaking from across a room. "It's starting again," I heard myself say. "The frequency is different this time, higher pitched, do you hear that?" There was a pause. I strained to listen for whatever I had been referring to, but heard only the baseline hum continuing. Then my voice again, more urgent. "They're right there, it's modulating, like it's trying to match something." The recording quality shifted, becoming grainier. In the background, I could make out what sounded like electronic interference, the kind you get when a phone is too close to a speaker. But there was a pattern to it, almost rhythmic. My recorded voice seemed to be responding to these sounds, though I couldn't understand the connection. "I can see the lights now," my voice continued. "They're not coming from outside, they're just there in the air, white but not white, brighter than they should be." The audio became increasingly distorted. My voice faded in and out, as if the microphone was moving or being covered intermittently. Near the end, I heard myself say something that made my skin prickle. "It knows I'm recording. I can feel it watching the phone." The recording cut off abruptly. I played it again immediately, but the second time through I noticed details I'd missed. Behind my voice there were other sounds, faint but definitely there. A low vibration that seemed to pulse in waves, and something else, a sound like fabric rustling or perhaps papers being shuffled. But there was no one else in the recording, at least no other voice. The strangest part was that I had no memory of making this recording at all. Not just forgotten, completely absent from my recollection. I tried to place when it might have happened based on the background sounds, the quality of my voice, anything that might trigger a memory. Nothing came. That night I found myself paying closer attention to the sounds in my apartment. The refrigerator's hum did seem different, though I couldn't pinpoint how. The air conditioning cycled on and off in patterns that felt irregular. When I turned off all the lights and electronics, the silence wasn't complete. There was still something there, barely perceptible, a frequency just at the edge of hearing. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, writing down anything unusual, small things mostly. The way shadows fell across the wall in the morning, the temperature variations in different rooms, how my coffee tasted when I drank it in certain spots in the kitchen versus others. After a few days, patterns emerged. The disturbances seemed to cluster around specific areas of my living space. The corner of the living room where the couch indentation kept reappearing, the space near the window that was always slightly cooler, a section of the hallway where the air felt thicker, more resistant. I began to have flashes of memory that felt more like half-remembered dreams, images without context, a room filled with white light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the sensation of floating, though I was clearly standing, sounds that vibrated through my bones rather than entering through my ears. In one of these fragments, I was holding something in my hands, small, smooth, warm to the touch despite being made of what felt like metal or plastic. It vibrated gently, irregularly, like a phone receiving messages, but when I looked down at it in the memory, my vision wouldn't focus properly. The object remained indistinct, important, but unknowable. The smell was what brought the next piece back. I was cooking something simple when the air suddenly carried a scent that stopped me cold. New plastic and cold blood, an impossible combination that shouldn't exist, yet was unmistakably familiar. The memory hit like a physical force. I was in my living room, but it wasn't my living room. The furniture was the same, positioned identically, but the walls seemed farther away, the ceiling higher. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with static electricity that made my skin tingle, and I wasn't alone. There was no one visible, but the presence was undeniable, something behind me just outside my peripheral vision. Every time I tried to turn around, the sensation moved, staying perpetually in that blind spot where you can sense but not see. My body knew it was there even when my mind insisted the room was empty. The lights in this memory room behaved strangely. They flickered not like failing bulbs, but in patterns that seemed almost communicative. Short bursts followed by longer illuminations, then rapid sequences that hurt to look at directly. The television was on, but instead of showing any program, the screen displayed what looked like interference, except the static moved in ways that suggested intention, forming almost shapes before dissolving back into chaos. I tried to speak in this memory to ask what was happening, but my voice came out wrong. The words felt heavy, distorted, as if the air was too thick to carry them properly. And when I did manage to speak, something responded, not with words, but with that electronic sound from the recording, a frequency that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. The memory fragmented there, dissolving back into the present where I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the lingering scent of new plastic and cold blood. I started noticing changes in my reflection. Nothing dramatic, just tiny delays, micro movements that didn't quite sync. When I raised my hand, my reflection would follow a split second later. When I turned my head, my mirrored self seemed to complete the motion just slightly out of time. At first, I attributed it to fatigue, stress, maybe I strained from staring at screens too long. But the delays became more pronounced. Sometimes I could swear my reflection was looking at something just to the left of where I was standing. Its attention focused on empty air while mine was directed at the mirror. These moments never lasted long, a blink, a shift in position, and everything would return to normal, but they were becoming more frequent. The sound started again, too. That same electronic interference from the recording, but now I was hearing it while fully awake and alert. It would emerge from the walls, or seem to, always when I was alone and the apartment was quiet. Sometimes it sounded like a distant radio trying to find a station. Other times it had that rhythmic quality, like a code being transmitted. I began recording these occurrences, but the audio files always came out clean. Whatever I was hearing didn't seem to register on my phone's microphone. This should have been reassuring, a sign that the sounds were internal, explainable, possibly medical. Instead, it felt more disturbing. If the sounds weren't real, why did they feel so familiar? Another fragment surfaced while I was washing dishes. My hands were in warm, soapy water when suddenly the sensation changed. The water felt different, not wet exactly, but something else entirely. Viscous without being thick, warm without being heated, and my hands weren't touching dishes anymore. In this memory, I was holding that object again, the smooth, vibrating thing that my vision couldn't quite resolve, but now I could feel it more clearly. It was roughly the size of a smartphone, but shaped differently, curved in ways that felt organic despite being artificial. The vibrations weren't random. They followed patterns that seemed to respond to my touch, my breathing, my heartbeat. The room around me in this fragment was my living room, but wrong again. This time the wrongness was more subtle. Everything was in its proper place, but the colors were off. Not dramatically, just shifted slightly along the spectrum, as if I was seeing through tinted glass. The walls were the same beige they'd always been, but with a greenish undertone that shouldn't have been there. The blue couch looked purple in certain light. And there were the sounds again, but clearer now. The electronic interference was coming from the object in my hands. It was communicating, though I couldn't understand the language. The frequencies would rise and fall, creating patterns that felt meaningful even if I couldn't decode them. Sometimes I found myself responding not with words, but with subtle changes in my breathing, my posture, the way I held the device. The presence behind me was stronger in this memory, more defined. I still couldn't see it directly, but I could sense its shape, its size. Larger than human, but not dramatically so. The way it moved or didn't move suggested it wasn't bound by the same physical rules I was. It could be in multiple positions simultaneously or shift between locations without crossing the space between them. What disturbed me most was that I wasn't afraid in the memory. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt calm, focused, almost meditative, as if this was a familiar routine, something I'd done many times before. The strangeness felt normal, expected. It was only in the present, trying to remember, that the fear crept in. The fragment ended when the presence moved closer. I could feel it directly behind me, close enough that I should have been able to feel its breath if it had been breathing. The object in my hands vibrated more intensely, and the electronic sounds became almost musical. Then everything went white, not dark, but blazingly, impossibly white, and I was back in my kitchen, hands still in the dishwater, heart racing. I started finding things in my apartment that didn't belong. Small items, easily overlooked. A pen with no brand markings that wrote in ink that seemed slightly too dark. A coin that looked familiar but didn't match any currency I recognized. A small piece of what looked like glass or crystal, perfectly clear but warm to the touch, that seemed to pulse with its own internal light when held in darkness. Each object triggered flashes of memory, brief glimpses of that other version of my living room. The pen had been used to write something, though I couldn't remember what. The coin had been payment for something, or perhaps a token, a marker. The crystal fragment had been part of something larger, something that had been broken or divided. The most disturbing discovery was a photograph I found tucked behind my bedroom mirror. It showed my living room, but from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The camera would have had to be positioned in the middle of the wall, looking down from a height that didn't match the room's actual dimensions. And there I was in the photo, sitting on my couch, but I wasn't alone. The presence was visible in the photograph. Not clearly, it appeared as a distortion in the air, a heat shimmer effect that bent the light around it. But it had definite boundaries, a shape that suggested something large and complex positioned directly behind my seated figure. In the photo, I was looking up at something outside the frame, my expression calm but intensely focused. I had no memory of this photograph being taken. The timestamp on the back meant nothing to me, and the handwriting wasn't mine. Someone had written a single word, documentation. The final fragment came when I was trying to sleep. I was lying in bed, eyes closed, when the familiar electronic sounds began again. But this time, instead of trying to ignore them or record them, I let myself sink into the rhythm. The frequencies seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, my breathing, the electrical activity in my brain. The memory that emerged was the clearest yet, but also the most impossible. I was standing in my living room, but it wasn't my living room, and it wasn't any room at all. The space extended far beyond the walls of my apartment, stretching into a vast area filled with soft, directionless light. The furniture was there, my couch, my coffee table, my television, but they were islands in an ocean of white space that seemed to go on forever. Others were there too, not people exactly, but consciousnesses, presences that moved through the space like currents in water. They communicated through the electronic sounds, through changes in light and vibration, through methods that bypassed language entirely, and I understood them. Not just their meaning, but their purpose, their nature, their relationship to me. I had been selected, chosen for something I couldn't quite grasp, but knew was important. The object in my hands, clearer now, revealed as a device of impossible complexity despite its simple appearance, was both a tool and a test. The vibrations it produced weren't random. They were my responses, my thoughts translated into frequencies that could be understood by minds that didn't think in words. The presence behind me wasn't threatening. It was observing, documenting, learning. I was a subject, but also a collaborator. The strangeness of the situation wasn't accidental. It was necessary. a way of bypassing the normal filters and assumptions that would have made true communication impossible. In this expanded memory, I could see the process happening. Parts of my consciousness were being carefully edited, not removed but repositioned, filed away in places where they wouldn't interfere with my normal life. The memories of these encounters were being preserved but locked, accessible only when the right conditions were met, the right triggers activated. I was being prepared for something larger, something that required both my participation and my ignorance. The encounters weren't ending, they were building towards something. Each session added layers, created connections, established protocols that would be activated when needed. The memory showed me understanding this, accepting it, even welcoming it, but it also showed me why I couldn't be allowed to remember clearly. The knowledge was too large, too foreign. My normal consciousness couldn't contain it without being fundamentally altered, so it was parceled out, distributed across time and awareness, accessible only in fragments. As the memory reached its peak clarity, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. I saw myself in the present moment, lying in bed, experiencing this very memory. The vast white space contained not just my living room, but my bedroom, my entire apartment, my entire life. I was simultaneously the observer and the observed, the subject and the documenter. The presence behind me moved closer, and for the first time I began to turn around to see it directly. As I rotated, the white space began to collapse, the memory started to fragment, but not before I caught a glimpse of something that defied every category my mind had for understanding reality. I woke up, or thought I did, but the electronic sounds continued. They were coming from everywhere now, from the walls, from the air itself. My reflection in the bedroom mirror was moving independently, turning to look at something I couldn't see. The objects I'd found were glowing softly in the darkness, pulsing in rhythm with the sounds. And I realized that the memory hadn't ended. I was still in it, had always been in it. The fragments weren't memories of something that had happened, they were glimpses of something that was still happening, had never stopped happening. My normal life, my confusion, my investigation, all of it was part of the process, part of the preparation. The presence was still behind me, had always been behind me. The object was still in my hands, though in this reality it looked like a phone, a notebook, a pen. The vast white space was still there, just hidden behind the familiar walls of my apartment. I sat up in bed and asked the question I'd been avoiding. What am I being prepared for? The electronic sounds shifted, became almost musical, almost like laughter. My reflection in the mirror smiled before I did. The objects on my nightstand vibrated in harmony. And somewhere in the frequency patterns, in the rhythm of the vibrations, in the delayed movements of my reflection, I heard an answer that wasn't an answer, a response that raised more questions than it resolved. You already know, you've always known. The question is, are you ready to remember? The sounds faded, my reflections synchronized, the objects went dark. But I could still feel it behind me, patient and eternal, waiting for my answer. Story 4. The initial inventory inspection commenced at 1800 hours. Rows of identical boxes lined the shelves, each barcode meticulously recorded. Scanning devices showed all items present and accounted for according to the digital ledger. Temperature controls remained constant, unwavering between documented check-ins. Dust gathered in corners, undisturbed by recent movements. An unopened delivery sat inconspicuously by the entrance, logged but lacking a corresponding dispatch record. All lights functioned properly, though the power indicator flickered irregularly. Exit routes were unobstructed, yet the motion sensors failed to register any activity. The air vent emitted a low hum, yet the security footage looped back 2 minutes. That much I remember clearly. Everything else comes in pieces now. The sound, it wasn't the hum I mentioned. This was different, deeper, like metal grinding against metal, but muffled as if it came from inside the walls themselves. My skin prickled when I heard it. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that sterile white glow, but underneath that grinding there was something else, a frequency that made my teeth ache. I pressed my palm against the nearest shelf, and I swear the vibration traveled up through my bones. The smell hit me then, sharp, chemical. Like burnt copper mixed with something organic I couldn't identify. It made my eyes water. I wasn't alone in there, I know that now, though I can't explain how I knew it then. The warehouse felt too full, too occupied for an empty space. My breath came shorter, like the air had thickened. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone behind me, but finding only those endless rows of boxes. Yet the feeling persisted, something watching, something waiting. The temperature hadn't changed according to the gauges, but sweat beaded on my forehead anyway. My scanner beeped with each barcode, but between those electronic chirps I heard something else. Breathing that wasn't mine, footsteps that stopped whenever I stopped moving. My thoughts scattered, simple calculations became impossible. I'd scanned the same box 3 times, forgetting I'd already logged it. Words felt foreign in my mouth when I tried to speak into my headset. The numbers on my device blurred together, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found myself standing in aisles I didn't remember walking to, holding items I couldn't recall picking up. Time stretched and compressed. Minutes felt like hours, then suddenly I'd lost entire chunks of the evening. My hands shook as I gripped the scanner. The familiar weight of it felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. The lights went out, not all at once, but in sequence, like dominoes falling. I stood frozen as darkness swallowed each row, creeping toward me with deliberate slowness. Then the opposite wall blazed with light so bright it burned my retinas. Shapes moved in that brilliance, not human shapes, geometric, angular. They shifted and folded in ways that hurt to follow with my eyes. The air itself seemed to ripple around them. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my throat. The scanner in my hand grew hot, then cold, then hot again. Its screen displayed symbols I'd never seen before, scrolling endlessly upward. The concrete floor beneath my feet felt soft, unstable, like it might give way at any moment. For weeks afterward, I tasted metal. Every morning I'd wake with that copper tang coating my tongue. My coffee tasted like pennies. Food lost all flavor except for that persistent metallic aftertaste. I'd catch myself checking locks multiple times before leaving home. Mirrors made me uncomfortable, not because of what I saw in them, but because of what I didn't see. Empty spaces that felt occupied, reflections that seemed to move a split second after I did. At work, I avoided the supply closets. The sound of ventilation systems made my skin crawl. I'd find myself counting things obsessively. Steps to my car, items in my shopping cart, tiles on the bathroom floor, always coming up with different numbers each time. But wait, the lights didn't go out. They flickered, yes, but they stayed on. I remember now. It was the shadows that moved. Long, dark shapes stretching across the floor despite the consistent overhead lighting. They reached toward me like fingers, bending around corners where no shadows should exist. The delivery box by the entrance was open. Had it been opened before, inside, instead of contents, there was just more space, impossible depth. I could see light at the bottom, far below, as if I was looking down a well. The grinding sound came from there. From that impossible space inside a simple cardboard box. I backed away, but my footsteps echoed strangely, multiplying until it sounded like an army retreating with me. I stopped trying to understand what happened that night. Understanding requires logic, and logic requires memory you can trust. Mine comes in fragments now, each piece sharp enough to cut but never fitting together properly. I've learned to live with the gaps, the contradictions, the way my mind flinches away from certain details. Sometimes I catch myself scanning empty spaces, my hand moving in familiar patterns even when I'm not at work. The metal taste has faded, but it returns whenever I think too hard about that evening. The warehouse still operates. I still work there, though I avoid the night shifts now. The delivery was processed eventually. The paperwork was filed. Everything returned to normal except for the part of me that never left that place. The part that's still standing in those fluorescent lit aisles, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist, watching shadows move independently of their sources. I don't try to remember anymore. I try not to remember too clearly. Some experiences aren't meant to be fully understood, only survived. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder if I really did survive it at all. Story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. That was the beginning, the exact moment when everything started to unravel, though I didn't understand it then. I've been carrying this memory for so long now, turning it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by constant handling. I'm thousands of miles away from that place now, sitting in a different house, in a different state, breathing different air. But distance doesn't matter when something follows you in ways that can't be measured on any map. I've never told anyone about this, not my family, not the few friends I still keep in touch with, not the therapists I've seen over the years. Every time I've tried to form the words, they've died in my throat like they were never meant to be spoken. But something's changed recently. Maybe it's because I'm tired of carrying this alone, or maybe it's because I'm starting to realize that keeping quiet hasn't protected me the way I thought it would. The house was supposed to be temporary, just a place to stay while I figured out what came next in my life. I'd taken a break from everything, needed space to think, to breathe. The rental was cheap because it sat alone on a stretch of rural road where neighbors were measured in miles rather than feet, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear for a while. It was an old farmhouse, the kind with thick walls and small windows that seemed to squint at the world outside. The realtor had mentioned it had been empty for a while, which explained the dust, the stale air, the way my footsteps echoed differently in each room. I didn't mind. Empty felt safe. Empty felt clean. The first few days passed quietly. I unpacked my few belongings, set up a workspace in what used to be a dining room, established routines that felt normal and grounding. I'd wake early, make coffee, work on my laptop until the afternoon light started to fade. The isolation felt healing. I convinced myself I was exactly where I needed to be. But houses have their own rhythms, and this one seemed to be finding its voice around me. At first, it was just the normal sounds of an old building settling into itself. Wood expanding and contracting, pipes adjusting to regular use, the furnace cycling on and off with mechanical reliability. I told myself these were good sounds, signs of a house coming back to life. The first thing that felt wrong was so subtle I almost missed it. I was working late one evening, the only light coming from my laptop screen and a small desk lamp. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but underneath that familiar drone I started to notice another sound, a lower frequency, almost below the range of hearing, more felt than heard, like a tuning fork struck somewhere deep in the walls. I lifted my fingers from the keyboard and listened. The sound seemed to pulse gently, rising and falling in slow waves. When I focused on it directly, it became harder to detect, as if it only existed in my peripheral awareness. I checked the furnace, thinking maybe something was loose or vibrating, but the basement was silent. The sound was gone by the time I returned to my desk. Over the next few nights, I started to notice it more frequently, always when I was alone and focused on something else, always just at the edge of perception. I began to wonder if it was something in my own body, maybe tension in my ears or blood pressure changes from the stress I'd been under. The mind can play tricks when you're isolated for too long. But then the lights started acting strange. It began with the lamp in my workspace. I'd be typing and catch a flicker in my peripheral vision, like someone had walked between the light and the wall. But when I looked up, nothing had changed. The lamp burned steady and warm, casting the same circle of yellow light it always had. I checked the bulb, thinking it might be loose, but it was screwed in tight. The flickers became more frequent. Not just the desk lamp, but the overhead fixtures, the reading light by the couch, even the harsh fluorescent in the kitchen. Never when I was looking directly at them, always in that space just outside my focused attention. Like the house was trying to communicate in a language of brief shadows and sudden brightness. I started keeping a small notebook, documenting when these things happened. Looking for patterns, trying to apply logic to something that felt increasingly illogical. The sound seemed stronger on certain nights, usually when the air pressure was dropping before a storm. The light disturbances happened most often in the evening hours between sunset and full darkness. I told myself I was gathering data, being scientific about it. Really, I was trying to convince myself that everything had an explanation. The smell appeared on a night when the autumn air had turned sharp and clean. I was reading in the living room when I caught a whiff of something sweet and metallic, like copper pennies mixed with overripe fruit. It was faint but distinct, completely out of place in the old house's usual palette of wood polish and dust. I searched every room, checking for gas leaks, spoiled food, anything that might explain the odor. But I couldn't locate a source, and after an hour of searching, it was gone. That smell would return at random intervals, always brief, always impossible to trace. Sometimes I'd catch it when I first woke up, as if it had been present in my dreams. Other times it would appear when I was in the middle of some mundane task, washing dishes or folding laundry. It began to feel like a signal, a marker of something I couldn't identify. The house was changing around me, or maybe I was changing within it. My sleep became restless, filled with dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me waking with a sense of unease. I'd find myself standing in rooms without remembering why I'd gone there. My concentration began to fray, work becoming harder to focus on as my attention was constantly drawn to sounds and movements that shouldn't have been there. I started avoiding mirrors, not consciously at first, but I realized I'd been turning away from reflective surfaces, keeping my eyes down when I passed the bathroom mirror, angling myself away from the dark windows at night. When I forced myself to look, everything appeared normal, but there was something in my peripheral vision, a sense of movement or presence that didn't match my own reflection. The breaking point came on a night when the first snow was falling. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard footsteps upstairs. Clear, deliberate steps moving from one end of the hallway to the other. I froze, listening, telling myself it was just the house settling, ice forming in the gutters, anything but what it sounded like. But the steps came again, slower this time, as if someone was being careful not to make noise. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty, of course. All the doors were closed, just as I'd left them. But the air felt different up there, charged with a kind of electric tension that made my skin crawl. And underneath the normal house smells, that sweet metallic scent was stronger than it had ever been. I checked every room, every closet, every space large enough for a person to hide. Nothing, but in the back bedroom, the one I'd been using for storage, I found something that stopped me cold. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, not by footprints exactly, but by something that had moved through the space. The patterns were wrong, too uniform, like something had been dragged across the floor in perfect parallel lines. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening to the house breathe around me. The low-frequency humming was constant now, no longer hiding at the edges of perception. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves were vibrating. And mixed with it, so faint I might have imagined it, was something that sounded almost like whispering. I left the next morning, packed my essential belongings in less than an hour, and drove away without looking back. I told myself I was being rational, that isolation had gotten to me, that I needed to be around people again. But even as I put miles between myself and that house, I could feel something following. Not physically, but in some other way that I still don't understand. The dreams started a few days after I settled into a hotel room in the city. Vivid, intense dreams where I was back in that house, moving through rooms that were familiar but wrong. The walls breathed in slow, deep cycles. The floors tilted at impossible angles. And always, just out of sight, something watched me with patient attention. I'd wake with that metallic taste in my mouth, my skin covered in goosebumps despite the warm room. The shower would wash away the physical sensations, but not the memory of being observed, studied, catalogued in some way I couldn't comprehend. Months passed, I found a new apartment, went back to work, tried to rebuild the routines of normal life. But normal felt like a costume that didn't quite fit anymore. Electronics seemed to malfunction around me more frequently than they should. Light bulbs burned out faster. I'd catch that sweet metallic smell in places where it had no business being. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I'd see things that weren't there. Shadows moving independently of their sources, reflections that lagged a split second behind my movements, brief flashes of white light that left no afterimage but somehow stayed burned into my memory. I started to understand that whatever I'd encountered in that house hadn't stayed behind. It had marked me in some way, left an impression that went deeper than memory. I was carrying something now, something that made me different from the person I'd been before. People began to notice it too, though they couldn't name what had changed. Conversations felt strained. Eye contact became difficult to maintain. I was becoming isolated again, but this time not by choice. The worst part is the certainty that it's not finished with me. Whatever lives in the spaces between perception and reality, whatever feeds on the boundary between presence and absence, it found something in me worth keeping. I can feel it sometimes, especially in the quiet hours before dawn, like a weight pressing against the inside of my skull. I'm recording this now because I need someone else to know, even if they don't believe it. I need these words to exist somewhere outside my own mind, proof that this happened, that I'm not losing my grip on reality. But even as I speak, I can feel that familiar electric tension building in the air around me. The taste of copper is creeping back into my mouth. I thought distance would save me. I thought time would heal whatever had been opened in that house. But some doors, once opened, never fully close. And some things, once they've found you, never really let you go. I'm still not alone, even here, even now. And I'm starting to think I never will be again. Story 6. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first, until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. I need to be clear about something right from the start. Nothing happened to me that night. I mean, nothing unusual. I went to bed at my regular time, slept through the night like I always do, and woke up feeling perfectly normal. There's really nothing to tell, which is why I'm not sure why I keep thinking about it. But since people seem to think there's some kind of story here, I suppose I can walk through what I remember. Though honestly, there's not much to remember. It was just a regular evening. I had dinner, watched some television, brushed my teeth. The usual routine. I didn't see anything strange when I looked out my window before closing the blinds, just the empty hallway dimly lit by that fluorescent light that always flickers. Though now that I think about it, the light wasn't flickering that night. It was perfectly still, which was odd because it always flickers. But that doesn't mean anything. Maintenance probably fixed it. I fell asleep easily. I always do. I'm a good sleeper, always have been. I didn't wake up at all during the night, which is normal for me. So I have no idea why I have this vague impression of sounds coming from the hallway. Not that there were any sounds, of course. I was asleep, but if there had been sounds, they might have been like footsteps, but not quite footsteps. More like something being dragged across the carpet. Heavy, deliberate, but I didn't hear anything because I was sleeping soundly. The thing is, I live on the 4th floor, and there's only one other apartment up here. The person who lives there works nights, so the hallway is always quiet after dark, which is why it would have been strange to hear anything at all. But I didn't hear anything, so it doesn't matter. I definitely didn't get up to look. I never get up during the night. I'm not the type of person who investigates strange noises, mainly because there weren't any strange noises to investigate. I stayed in bed the entire night under my covers, facing the wall away from the door. I didn't turn toward the door at all. I certainly didn't notice that thin line of light that usually shows under my door had gone dark, as if something was blocking it from the other side. The temperature in my apartment is always consistent. I keep the thermostat at the same setting every night, so there's no reason I would have felt cold, and definitely no reason I would have started shivering. I must have been coming down with something, though I felt fine the next day. It's the only explanation for why my breath might have been visible in my own bedroom, though of course it wasn't visible because that would be impossible. I want to emphasize that I never opened my door that night. I have no reason to open my door after I've gone to bed, and I certainly didn't have any reason that particular night. I didn't hear my name being called softly from the hallway. Nobody knows my name except the landlord, and he wouldn't be wandering around the building at night. It must have been the wind, or maybe sound carrying from another floor, even though the voice sounded like it was coming from right outside my door. Even though it sounded patient, like whoever was calling had all the time in the world to wait for me to answer. Since I didn't open the door, I couldn't have seen the hallway, but if I had opened it, I imagine it would have looked normal. The same beige carpet, the same white walls, the same fluorescent light overhead, except the light was off, which never happens. The building management keeps those lights on all night for safety reasons, but maybe there was a power issue. That would explain why the hallway was so dark, and why that darkness seemed to move slightly, like it was breathing. I definitely didn't step into the hallway. My feet never left my apartment. I stayed inside, door closed, safe and warm in my own space. So I have no idea why I can picture the carpet so clearly, how it felt different under bare feet, softer somehow and slightly damp. There was probably a leak somewhere in the building. That would explain the metallic smell too, though it wasn't really metallic, more like copper pennies mixed with something organic. But I wouldn't know because I never smelled anything unusual. The elevator at the end of the hall is always quiet at night. It's an old building, so when the elevator moves, you can hear it throughout the entire floor. The cables creak, the motor hums, the doors make that distinctive ding when they open. Which is why it was strange that I didn't hear any of those sounds, even though I could see the elevator doors standing open. Not that I could see them, because I wasn't in the hallway, but if I had been, I would have noticed that the elevator car wasn't there. Just an empty shaft going down into darkness that seemed much deeper than 4 floors. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for all of this. Old buildings make strange noises. Heating systems cause temperature fluctuations. Electrical issues can cause lighting problems. I probably dreamed the whole thing, which would explain why the details are so vivid. Dreams can feel very real sometimes, especially when you're stressed about work or other daily concerns. The only thing that's slightly confusing is why I remember walking toward the elevator. Not that I actually walked toward it, because I never left my apartment. But in this dream, or whatever it was, my feet moved without my permission. Each step felt deliberate, necessary, like I was being drawn forward by something I couldn't resist. The carpet was definitely damp, and it squelched slightly with each step. There were dark stains that looked almost black in the dim light that wasn't there. I didn't look down into the elevator shaft. That would have been dangerous, and I'm always careful about safety. But somehow I know what I would have seen if I had looked. The shaft went down much further than it should have, past the basement, past the foundation, into spaces that couldn't possibly exist under our building. There were other floors down there, floors that weren't on any building plan, with hallways that stretched in directions that didn't make sense. The air coming up from the shaft was warm and carried that copper smell more strongly. It also carried sounds, though they were so faint they might have been my imagination. Voices, maybe, calling from very far below. Not words exactly, but something that sounded almost like singing. Harmonies that didn't follow any musical structure I recognized, rising and falling in patterns that made my skin crawl. But none of this actually happened, so it doesn't matter what the voices sounded like or how they seemed to be calling my name in languages I didn't understand. I was asleep in my bed the entire night. I never stood at the edge of an elevator shaft that opened onto impossible depths. I never felt the warm air rising from below, carrying with it the promise of answers to questions I didn't know I had. I certainly never considered stepping into that empty shaft. The thought never crossed my mind, mainly because I wasn't there to have such thoughts. But if I had been there, I might have noticed how easy it would have been. One small step forward, and then I could have floated down into those deeper levels, following the voices that seemed so familiar, so welcoming. Something held me back, though. Not fear exactly, because there was nothing to be afraid of. More like a nagging sense that I had responsibilities up here in the normal world. Work in the morning, bills to pay, routine maintenance of an ordinary life. These mundane concerns felt suddenly heavy, like chains keeping me anchored to a reality I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. I must have stood there for a long time, though of course I wasn't actually standing anywhere. In my dream, the voices from below grew more insistent, more personal. They knew things about me, private things I'd never told anyone. They promised explanations for all the small mysteries that had been accumulating in my life. The moved shoes, the flickering lights, the sense of being watched when I thought I was alone. Eventually, I turned away from the shaft and walked back to my apartment. At least, I think I did. The memory gets fuzzy here, which makes sense because it was just a dream. I remember my door standing open, which was strange because I always keep it locked. But in dreams, details like that don't always make sense. I went back to bed and slept peacefully for the rest of the night. When I woke up in the morning, everything was normal. The hallway light was flickering again, just like always. The elevator was working properly, stopping at all the correct floors. There were no damp spots on the carpet, no strange smells, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. I went about my normal routine, made my coffee, checked the news. The shoes outside my neighbor's door were both there, properly aligned, just like they should be. Everything was exactly as it always is, which proves that nothing happened that night. It was just a particularly vivid dream, the kind that sticks with you for a few days before fading into the background of forgotten sleep experiences. I haven't thought much about it since then. There's no reason to dwell on something that wasn't real. I sleep just as well as I always have, and I certainly don't find myself listening for sounds in the hallway. I don't check to make sure my door is locked multiple times before bed, and I definitely don't avoid looking at the elevator when I come home from work. The building has been quiet lately, which is nice. My neighbor seems to be keeping more regular hours, so there's less coming and going at odd times. The maintenance staff must have fixed whatever was causing the electrical issues, because all the lights work perfectly now. Even the elevator seems to run more smoothly, though I've been taking the stairs more often lately. It's good exercise. Sometimes I catch myself pausing in the hallway, usually when I'm coming home with groceries or mail. Not because I'm remembering anything specific, but because the space feels different somehow. More spacious, like it extends further than it should in all directions. But that's just a trick of perspective, probably caused by the new lighting they installed. I'm sleeping better than ever, actually. Deep, dreamless sleep that leaves me feeling refreshed in the morning. I haven't had any more of those vivid dreams about elevators or impossible spaces. My subconscious has clearly moved on to more mundane concerns, which is exactly what you'd expect from a healthy, well-adjusted person. The only thing that's slightly odd is how much I've been thinking about those voices lately. Not because I heard them, obviously, but because the memory of the dream is so persistent. I find myself humming melodies that don't sound familiar, harmonies that seem to come from somewhere deeper than normal musical memory. But everyone gets songs stuck in their heads sometimes. It's perfectly normal. I've been having trouble with my elevator key card lately. Sometimes it doesn't register when I try to access certain floors, which is frustrating because I know the card worked fine before. The building manager says there's nothing wrong with the system, and my card shows no signs of damage. He suggested I might be trying to access floors that don't exist, which doesn't make sense because I only ever go to my own floor. When I mentioned this to him, he looked at me strangely and asked what I meant by other floors. I told him about the basement levels, the ones below the parking garage, and he said there are no basement levels below the parking garage. According to him, the building only has 4 floors above ground and 1 below, but I distinctly remember seeing the directory in the elevator that listed additional sub-levels. Though when I went to check it again, the directory only showed the floors he mentioned. I must have misremembered. It's easy to confuse details like that, especially when you're tired or distracted. Memory isn't always reliable, particularly when it comes to mundane things like building layouts. I probably saw a directory from a different building and somehow associated it with this one. The important thing is that everything is back to normal now. I sleep well, work productively, maintain my regular routines. There's no reason for anyone to be concerned about my mental state or my ability to distinguish between dreams and reality. I'm functioning perfectly well, better than well, actually. Tonight I'm planning to go to bed early and get a full night's rest. I've been feeling a little tired lately, probably because I've been staying up too late thinking about things that don't matter. A good night's sleep will clear my head and help me focus on more important concerns. I'm not expecting any disturbances. The building has been quiet, my neighbors have been considerate, and there's no reason to anticipate any problems. I'll close my blinds, lock my door, and settle into bed with a clear conscience and a peaceful mind. Though I have noticed that the elevator has been running more frequently at night lately, and sometimes it stops on my floor even though I didn't call it. Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway. Sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time, when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. The smell returns now, sometimes in the middle of ordinary afternoons. I'll be washing dishes or folding laundry, and suddenly the air shifts. That same cloying sweetness fills my nostrils, and I freeze. My hands begin to shake without warning. The water keeps running, but I can't move to turn it off. I stand there, paralyzed, waiting for something I can't name to happen again. Sleep has become a stranger to me. When I do manage to drift off, I wake to find my bedroom bathed in a soft, pulsing light that seems to come from nowhere. The walls glow faintly, as if lit from within, casting no shadows. I've checked every possible source, the streetlights outside, the neighbor's porch, even the digital clock on my nightstand, but nothing explains it. The light has a quality that makes my skin crawl, too clean, too uniform. It reminds me of something medical, something sterile. My electronics have developed their own routine now. The television turns itself on at irregular intervals, always tuned to static. The refrigerator hums in patterns that don't match its normal cycle, 3 short bursts, then silence, then a long, sustained note that makes my teeth ache. My phone battery drains completely overnight, even when I leave it charging. Sometimes I find applications running that I never opened, the screen displaying scrambled text in languages I don't recognize. The dreams are the worst part, not nightmares exactly, but something more invasive. I find myself standing in vast, empty spaces filled with that orange scent, surrounded by a silence so complete it feels solid. In these dreams, I'm always searching for something, or someone is searching for me. I can never tell which. When I wake, my sheets are soaked with sweat that smells metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. People have stopped believing me when I try to explain. They nod politely and change the subject, their eyes taking on that careful, concerned look reserved for the unstable. I've learned to keep quiet about the way shadows sometimes move independently of their sources, or how certain rooms in my house feel occupied even when I'm alone. The isolation is almost worse than the phenomena themselves. But I remember now what started all of this. The memory comes back in fragments, like pieces of a photograph slowly developing in chemical baths. There was a place where I went months ago seeking solitude, a small cabin nestled in woods so thick they seemed to swallow sound itself. I had rented it for a week, desperate to escape the noise and chaos of daily life. On the 3rd night, something changed. I was sitting by the window watching the tree line when I noticed a figure standing among the distant pines. At first I assumed it was another camper or perhaps a park ranger making rounds, but the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, just at the edge of where the moonlight could reach, neither approaching nor retreating. Hours passed and still it remained. I found myself unable to look away, though every instinct screamed that I should close the curtains and retreat to bed. The figure had no discernible features, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I watched, the air in the cabin began to change. It grew thick and heavy, carrying that now familiar scent of overripe fruit. My vision started to blur around the edges. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse gently, breathing with a rhythm that didn't match my own heartbeat. I tried to stand, to move away from the window, but my legs felt disconnected from my body. The last thing I remember clearly is the figure raising what might have been an arm, gesturing toward me with deliberate slowness. Then there's nothing, a gap in my memory that spans several hours. When awareness returned, I was lying on the cabin floor, fully dressed but somehow different. My clothes smelled of ozone and that sickly sweet orange scent. My skin felt tender as if I had been sunburned, though I had spent the entire evening indoors. Most disturbing of all, my watch had stopped, its hands frozen at a time I couldn't remember seeing. Now, working backward through the haze of those days, I recall other signs I should have noticed. The cabin's electricity had been unreliable from the moment I arrived. Lights would dim and brighten without cause, and the small radio I had brought produced only static punctuated by brief, unintelligible whispers. I had attributed these disturbances to the remote location and old wiring. The wildlife had gone silent, too. During my first 2 days, the forest had been alive with the usual sounds of birds and small creatures moving through the underbrush. But by the 3rd day, an unnatural quiet had settled over the area. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air had grown reluctant to move. I remember now the sensation that had begun even before I saw the figure. A feeling of being observed, of eyes tracking my movements from some hidden vantage point. I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder while hiking the nearby trails, certain that I was no longer alone, but unable to identify the source of my unease. The ground itself had felt different under my feet. What should have been solid earth seemed to vibrate with a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. I could feel it more than hear it, a subtle trembling that made my bones ache. At night, lying in the cabin's narrow bed, I would press my palm against the wall and feel that same gentle pulsing, as if the building sat atop something vast and alive. Even earlier, during my drive to the cabin, there had been anomalies I had dismissed at the time. The GPS in my car had malfunctioned repeatedly, showing my location as somewhere far from any road. The radio had picked up signals that seemed to come from impossible distances, voices speaking in measured, monotone cadences about subjects I couldn't quite grasp. But before all of that, there had been normalcy. I had woken that first morning in my own bed in my own house, with nothing more pressing on my mind than the need for a brief escape from routine. The sun had been shining through familiar windows, casting ordinary shadows across ordinary furniture. I had packed my few belongings with the simple intention of spending a week reading and walking in peaceful solitude. The drive had begun uneventfully. Traffic moved at its usual pace, and the landscape rolled by in predictable patterns of suburban development giving way to rural farmland and eventually to forest. I had felt optimistic, even eager, for the first time in months. The cabin had been recommended by a colleague who described it as the perfect retreat for anyone seeking genuine isolation. I had no way of knowing, as I pulled into that narrow dirt driveway, that I was driving towards something that would fundamentally alter my relationship with reality itself. The cabin had looked exactly as advertised, rustic but comfortable, surrounded by towering trees and blessed with the kind of profound quiet that city dwellers dream of experiencing. That first evening I had sat on the small porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set through the canopy above. The air had been clean and cool, carrying only the expected scents of pine and earth. Birds called to each other across the clearing, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the gentle sound of running water from a stream I planned to find the next day. I had felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in years, completely unaware that something was already beginning to take notice of my presence. Something that would follow me home and weave itself into the fabric of my daily existence, leaving me forever changed and forever watched by eyes that reflect no light and cast no shadow. Story 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside, yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. Nothing really happened that night. I want to make that clear from the start. Whatever I thought I experienced was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stress from work had been building up and I hadn't been sleeping well. That's all it was. A tired brain creating patterns where none existed, filling in blanks with impossible details. I didn't see anything unusual when I walked past that building. It was just another structure on my usual route home, nothing special about it. The windows were dark, which is perfectly normal for that area after sunset. Most of the businesses, they're close early anyway. I wasn't even paying attention to it, really. My mind was elsewhere, focused on getting home and out of the rain. But I do remember the way the building seemed to breathe. Not literally, of course. That's ridiculous. Buildings don't breathe. It was probably just the wind creating some kind of optical illusion with the shadows. The facade appeared to expand and contract ever so slightly, like lungs filling with air. The brick surface rippled in a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I must have been more tired than I thought to notice something so mundane and interpret it as significant. The front door was closed, I'm certain of that. I never went inside. There would be no reason for me to enter a building I didn't recognize, especially not at that hour. The door was painted blue, a deep navy that seemed to absorb the streetlight rather than reflect it. The paint was fresh, still tacky to the touch, though I wouldn't know that firsthand since I never touched it. There were no numbers visible on the door, no nameplate or business sign. Just that blue surface with 3 small windows arranged vertically, each one perfectly square and dark. I kept walking. That's what any reasonable person would do. The rain was getting heavier and I wanted to get home. My shoes were already soaked through and I could feel the cold water seeping into my socks. Each step made a soft squelching sound against the wet pavement. Behind me I thought I heard an echo of my footsteps, but slightly off rhythm, as if someone was trying to match my pace but couldn't quite manage it. When I turned to look, the street was empty. Just the rain and the dim glow of the streetlights creating pools of yellow on the asphalt. I didn't go back to investigate. There was nothing to investigate. The sound was probably just the rain hitting the building's gutters, or maybe a loose piece of metal siding moving in the wind. Old buildings make all sorts of noises. It's completely normal. The fact that it sounded like deliberate footsteps, like someone carefully placing their feet to avoid making too much noise, was just my imagination adding narrative to random sounds. The next morning I took the same route to work. The building looked different in daylight, smaller somehow. The blue door was there exactly as I remembered it, but now it seemed ordinary, just a door. The windows on the upper floors reflected the cloudy sky, and I could see the outline of furniture inside some of the rooms. Office chairs, filing cabinets, the usual things you'd expect to find in a commercial building. Nothing mysterious about it at all. But I couldn't shake the memory of the 3rd floor window, the one that had been glowing with a soft, warm light that didn't seem to come from any visible source. Not glowing, actually. That's too strong a word. It was more like the darkness. There was less dark than it should have been, as if the night itself was thinner in that spot, allowing something else to show through. I hadn't noticed it the night before because I wasn't looking up. I was focused on getting home, on avoiding the rain. There was no reason for me to have seen that window at all. I tried to identify which window it might have been, counting up from the ground floor. 3rd floor, 4th window from the left, but in daylight they all looked the same. Clean glass reflecting the ordinary world back at me. No sign of the strange luminescence I thought I'd witnessed. It must have been a reflection of something else, maybe headlights from a passing car hitting the glass at just the right angle. That would explain the warm quality of the light, the way it seemed to pulse gently like a slow heartbeat. Work was busy that day, which was good. It kept my mind occupied with real, tangible problems that had logical solutions. I didn't think about the building or the strange echoing footsteps or the way the air had tasted metallic when I'd walked past. Air doesn't have a taste, of course. That's just something people say when they're trying to describe a smell they can't quite identify. It was probably just the rain washing dust and pollution out of the atmosphere. Urban air always has that slightly sharp quality after a storm. During my lunch break, I found myself walking past the building again. Not intentionally, it just happened to be on the way to the sandwich shop I like. The blue door was propped open now, and I could see into a small lobby area. White walls, gray carpeting, a reception desk with no one behind it. Perfectly normal. There was a directory on the wall listing various businesses, an accounting firm, a small law office, a consulting company I'd never heard of. The kind of generic professional services you'd find in any office building. I didn't go inside, there was no reason to, but I did notice the smell drifting out from the open doorway. That same metallic scent from the night before, but stronger now, mixed with something else. Something organic and warm, like bread baking or coffee brewing, but not quite either of those things. It made my mouth water and my stomach turn at the same time. The lobby was empty, but I could hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Muffled conversation, the kind you hear through thick walls or from a great distance. One of the voices sounded familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but it reminded me of someone I used to know, a teacher maybe, or a neighbor from when I was younger. The cadence was distinctive, with long pauses between words and a slight accent I couldn't identify. The voice was explaining something, speaking in the patient tone you use when teaching someone something complex. I couldn't make out the actual words, but the rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical. I realized I'd been standing there for several minutes, just listening. A woman walked by and gave me a curious look, probably wondering why I was loitering outside an office building. I felt embarrassed and continued on to the sandwich shop, but all through lunch I kept thinking about that voice. It wasn't until I was walking back to work that I remembered where I'd heard it before. It was my own voice, but different somehow. Calmer, more confident. The way I sound in my head versus how I actually sound when recorded. That's impossible, obviously. I wasn't in that building. I've never been inside it. The voice was just similar to mine, the way strangers sometimes sound like people you know. It's a common phenomenon. Your brain tries to match new input with familiar patterns, creating connections that don't actually exist. There's nothing supernatural or significant about it. Just the mind's tendency to impose meaning on random sensory data. I worked late that evening, staying at the office until well after sunset. By the time I left, the streets were mostly empty. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet, reflecting the streetlights and creating the illusion of depth beneath the surface. My footsteps echoed off the buildings as I walked, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. When I reached the Blue Door building, I stopped, not because I intended to, but because my feet simply wouldn't carry me any further. The door was closed now, but there was light seeping out around the edges, a thin golden line that outlined the frame. The light had that same warm quality I'd noticed in the third-floor window, but more intense. It pulsed gently, like a slow strobe, and with each pulse I felt a corresponding flutter in my chest. I should have kept walking. There was no reason to stand there staring at a door, but something about the light was mesmerizing. It seemed to be calling to me, though that's a ridiculous thing to say about light. Light doesn't call to people, it's just electromagnetic radiation. It has no consciousness, no intent. The fact that it seemed to brighten when I looked directly at it was probably just my eyes adjusting to the darkness around it. The door handle was warm when I touched it, not hot, just warm, as if someone had been gripping it moments before. The metal had a smooth, worn feeling, like it had been handled thousands of times. When I turned it, the mechanism moved silently, well-oiled and precise. The door swung open without a sound, revealing the same lobby I'd seen earlier, but different now. The white walls seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the gray carpet looked deeper, more plush. Like it would be soft to walk on, even in wet shoes. I didn't go inside, I want to be clear about that. I stood in the doorway for a moment, maybe two, and then I left. I closed the door behind me and continued home. Whatever I thought I saw in that lobby was just a trick of the lighting, shadows, and reflections creating false impressions. The fact that I remember the ceiling perfectly, remember the way the acoustic tiles were arranged in a grid pattern with one tile slightly askew in the far corner, doesn't mean I was actually there. Memory is unreliable. Sometimes we remember things we've only imagined. The elevator was directly across from the entrance, its brass doors polished to a mirror finish. I could see myself reflected in them, but the reflection looked different somehow, more confident, more purposeful. The person in the reflection was wearing the same clothes I was, but they fit better on them. They stood straighter, smiled more easily. When I raised my hand to touch my face, the reflection moved a split second too late, as if it was copying me rather than mirroring me. I didn't press the call button. The elevator came anyway, arriving with a soft chime that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The doors opened to reveal an interior lined with dark wood paneling and lit by a single overhead fixture that cast everything in warm, golden tones. The button panel showed 5 floors, but there were 6 buttons. The extra one was at the bottom, unmarked and slightly larger than the others. It had been pressed recently. I could tell because it was still faintly warm and slightly depressed, as if someone's finger had just lifted from it. I stepped back from the elevator. The doors stayed open for longer than usual, as if waiting for me to change my mind. Finally, they closed with the same soft chime, and I heard the car begin to move, but instead of going up, it went down. The sound of the motor faded gradually, as if the elevator was descending much further than should have been possible in a 5-story building. I left then, really left. I walked home quickly, not looking back, not thinking about what I'd seen or thought I'd seen. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. The human brain is capable of creating incredibly detailed false experiences when it's under strain. Everything I remembered could be explained as a waking dream, a brief dissociative episode triggered by fatigue. But I couldn't explain why my shoes were clean when I got home. They'd been muddy when I left work, stained from walking through puddles on the way to the building. Now they were spotless, as if they'd been carefully cleaned while I was wearing them. The leather even had a slight shine to it, like it had been polished. My socks were dry too, though I distinctly remembered the uncomfortable squish of wet fabric between my toes. I took a shower and went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head, but I dreamed about the building all night. In the dreams, I was walking through corridors I'd never seen, past doors that led to rooms I'd never entered. The carpet was thick under my feet, muffling my footsteps so completely that I moved in perfect silence. The walls were lined with paintings, but when I tried to look at them directly, they became blurry and indistinct. I could only see them clearly from the corner of my eye. In one dream, I was riding the elevator. The unmarked button was glowing softly, and without thinking, I pressed it. The car began to descend, but instead of stopping after a few seconds, it kept going. Down and down, far below the building's foundation, into spaces that shouldn't exist. When the doors finally opened, I found myself looking out at a vast underground chamber lit by the same warm, golden light I'd seen seeping around the blue door. I woke up before I could step out of the elevator. The dream had been so vivid that for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. My apartment seemed unfamiliar, the furniture arranged differently than I remembered. but that's normal after a particularly intense dream. It takes a few minutes for your brain to fully reconnect with reality. I didn't walk past the building for the next few days. I took a different route to work, one that added 10 minutes to my commute but avoided that particular street entirely. I told myself it was because I wanted a change of scenery, but really I just didn't want to see that blue door again. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. But avoidance only works for so long. Eventually, I found myself back on my usual route, drawn by the simple convenience of familiar paths. The building looked exactly the same, unremarkable in daylight. The blue door was closed, the windows were dark, and there was no sign of the strange phenomena I thought I'd experienced. It was just another building, no different from dozens of others in the area. Except for the fact that I knew the layout of the third floor perfectly. I could visualize every room, every hallway, every door. I knew that the conference room had a long oak table with 12 chairs around it, and that one of the chairs squeaked when you leaned back in it. I knew that the bathroom at the end of the hall had a mirror that reflected things slightly differently than they actually were, showing you as you could be rather than as you are. I'd never been to the third floor. I'd never been inside the building at all. These weren't memories, they were fantasies, elaborate constructions built from stress and imagination. The mind is capable of creating incredibly detailed fictional scenarios and then treating them as if they were real experiences. It's a well-documented phenomenon, nothing to be concerned about. But I could still taste the metallic air from that night. I could still feel the warmth of the door handle under my palm. And sometimes, when I walked past the building, I thought I could hear my own voice drifting out from the upper floors, speaking words I didn't remember saying to people I'd never met. Today feels different though, calmer, more settled. I've accepted that whatever happened or didn't happen that night was just a product of an overactive imagination. There's nothing mysterious about the building, nothing supernatural about the blue door or the warm light or the elevator that goes to floors that don't exist. It's all perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. The rain is starting again, and I can see the building from my office window. The blue door is barely visible from this distance, just a small rectangle of color against the gray facade. As I watch, a figure approaches the door. They pause for a moment just as I did, then reach for the handle. The door opens and they step inside, disappearing into the warm, golden light of the lobby. I should probably head home soon. The rain is getting heavier and I don't want to get caught in it again. I'll take my usual route, the one that goes right past the building with the blue door. There's no reason to avoid it anymore. After all, nothing happened there, nothing at all. And if the door happens to be open when I walk by, if that familiar voice happens to be drifting out into the evening air, if the elevator happens to be waiting with its brass doors polished and gleaming, well, that's just coincidence. Just the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary building on an ordinary street. The light is starting to seep around the edges of the door again. Story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. Nothing happened that night. I want to make that clear from the start. There was nothing unusual about walking home, nothing strange about the way the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual. I didn't see anything. The shadows were just shadows, and the feeling of being watched was probably just fatigue from a long day. It was completely ordinary. I remember thinking how quiet it was, but that's normal for that part of town. The silence wasn't unusual. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels like it's listening to you, waiting for you to make a sound so it can swallow it up. That's ridiculous. It was just a regular Tuesday evening, and I was tired, that's all. The street looked the same as always. The same cracked pavement, the same mailboxes, the same row of houses with their windows glowing warm and yellow, except some of the windows weren't glowing. They were dark, but not the comfortable dark of people who have gone to bed early. They were dark in a way that seemed deliberate, like the darkness was looking out instead of looking in. But I'm sure I imagined that. I must have been more exhausted than I thought. I didn't stop walking. There was no reason to stop. The footsteps behind me were probably just an echo of my own shoes on the concrete. The fact that they didn't quite match my rhythm doesn't mean anything. Sound travels strangely sometimes, especially when you're tired. The steps seemed lighter than mine, more deliberate, like someone trying very hard not to make noise while still making just enough noise to be heard. But that's impossible. No one was there. When I turned around, the street was empty, completely empty, just the way it should be. The lamppost at the corner was flickering, but old lights do that. The way it flickered in a pattern, almost like it was trying to communicate something that was just a coincidence. 3 short flickers, 3 long ones, 3 short again, just faulty wiring, nothing more. I kept walking because there was nothing else to do. My house was only 2 blocks away, and everything was perfectly normal. The air wasn't thicker than usual. It didn't taste metallic like pennies left in the rain. I wasn't having trouble breathing. The feeling of something pressing against my chest was probably just anxiety from work stress. It happens to everyone. The thing is, I never actually saw anything. Not really. There might have been a shape moving between the houses, but it was probably just a cat or maybe a dog that got loose. The way it moved wasn't quite right for an animal, too fluid, too purposeful, like it was studying me rather than just wandering around. But in poor light, everything looks strange. Your mind fills in details that aren't there. I didn't hear any voices. The sound that might have been whispering was just wind through the trees, even though the leaves weren't moving. Even though there wasn't any wind that night, the air was perfectly still, so still it felt solid, like I was walking through something thicker than air. But that's just how some evenings feel. There's nothing unusual about that. My key worked fine in the front door. It didn't stick the way it sometimes does when the weather changes. I didn't have to try 3 times before it turned. And I certainly didn't hear that soft clicking sound like someone else was unlocking a door at exactly the same moment, somewhere very close by. That would be impossible. The neighbors were all asleep. Their houses were dark, remember. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The living room was the same. The kitchen was the same. Nothing had been moved or touched or rearranged in subtle ways that I couldn't quite identify. The feeling that someone had been in my house while I was gone was just paranoia. The slight warmth in the air, like body heat that hadn't quite dissipated, that was just the heating system doing its job. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my usual chair. The tea tasted normal. It didn't have that strange metallic aftertaste, and it certainly didn't taste like it had been sitting out for hours even though I'd just made it. The mug wasn't warmer than it should have been, as if someone else had been holding it. These are the kinds of details your mind invents when you're stressed. I watched television for a while. The programs were the same ones that are always on at that hour. The static that kept interrupting the signal was probably just interference from the weather. The way the static seemed to form patterns, almost like it was trying to show me something, that was just my imagination. Static is random. Everyone knows that. I went to bed at my usual time. The bedroom was exactly as I'd left it. The window was closed and locked, just like always. I didn't notice that the lock was warm to the touch, or that there were condensation marks on the glass that looked almost like fingerprints pressed against the outside. And I certainly didn't see the shape standing in the yard, perfectly still, facing my window. Because there was no shape, there was nothing in the yard except the old oak tree and the fence and the shadow they cast in the moonlight. The shadow that seemed too dense, too solid, like it was made of something heavier than the absence of light. But shadows always look strange at night. That's perfectly normal. I fell asleep easily. I didn't lie awake listening to sounds that shouldn't have been there. The soft tapping on the window was probably just a branch, even though the nearest branch was too far away to reach. The sound of someone trying the door handle downstairs was probably just the house settling. Old houses make all kinds of noises. I dreamed normal dreams. I didn't dream about standing in a room I'd never seen before, with walls that curved impossibly and a ceiling that seemed to breathe. I didn't dream about voices that spoke without words, saying things I understood perfectly even though they made no sense. The dream where I was watching myself sleep from somewhere above my own bed, that was just a common anxiety dream. Everyone has those. When I woke up, it was morning. Everything was exactly as it should be. The sunlight coming through the window was warm and yellow and normal. It didn't have that strange quality, like it was shining through water, or like it was coming from somewhere much farther away than the sun. The way it seemed to avoid certain corners of the room was just the natural pattern of light and shadow. I got dressed and went about my day. I didn't think about the night before because there was nothing to think about. Nothing had happened. The feeling that I was forgetting something important was just the usual morning grogginess. The sense that something had changed, that some fundamental rule about the way things work had been quietly altered while I slept, that was just my imagination. At work, people asked if I was feeling all right. I looked tired, they said, pale, like I hadn't slept well, but I had slept well. I told them I felt fine, and I did feel fine. The way my coffee tasted wrong, like it had been mixed with something I couldn't identify, that was probably just a bad batch. The way my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to be looking at something just over my shoulder, that was just a trick of the fluorescent lighting. I went home the same way I always do, different route, of course. I took the main street instead of the side streets, stayed where there were plenty of lights and people, not because I was avoiding anything. There was nothing to avoid, I just felt like taking a different route. The fact that I kept checking over my shoulder was just habit. The feeling that something was following me at a distance, staying just out of sight, that was just paranoia left over from being tired. My house looked exactly the same. The front door was locked just as I'd left it. The spare key was still under the flower pot where I always keep it. It wasn't warmer than it should have been, like someone else had been handling it recently. The slight depression in the soil around the flower pot, like someone had knelt there, was probably just from the last rain. Inside, everything was normal. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, all exactly as they should be. I didn't notice that the furniture had been moved slightly, just an inch or two, just enough to make the room feel different without being obvious about it. The books on my shelf were in the same order they'd always been. The fact that I couldn't remember ever owning some of them was just because I have a lot of books. You can't remember everything. I made dinner and ate it while watching the news. The food tasted fine. The news was the usual mix of local stories and weather. I didn't pay attention to the reporters' words because they weren't important. Something about unusual atmospheric conditions, about people reporting strange experiences, about experts being unable to explain certain phenomena. But local news always has stories like that. It's just filler. I went to bed early. The bedroom was comfortable and familiar. The window was closed and locked. I didn't check it twice or 3 times or stand there for several minutes making sure the lock was properly engaged. The curtains were drawn tight. Nothing could see in, and more importantly, I couldn't see out. not that there was anything to see. I'm sleeping better now, the dreams are less vivid. I hardly ever wake up with the feeling that someone has been standing next to my bed watching me sleep. The impression of weight on the mattress, like someone sitting on the edge, that only happens occasionally now, and it's probably just the springs settling. Old mattresses do that. The important thing is that nothing happened, nothing is happening, everything is completely normal, and it always has been. The feeling that something is building, that whatever didn't happen that night was just the beginning, that's just anxiety. The sense that I'm being prepared for something, studied, evaluated, that's just stress from work. Tonight I'm going to bed at my usual time. I'm going to sleep peacefully, just like always. I'm not going to think about the sound of footsteps on the roof, or the way the shadows in my room seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them. I'm not going to wonder about the dreams that feel more real than being awake, or the way I sometimes catch myself having conversations I don't remember starting. Everything is fine, everything has always been fine, and tomorrow morning when I wake up, everything will still be fine. The notification light is blinking now, story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. I keep reading that report over and over. It's typed on clean white paper, but I don't remember writing it. The words feel familiar in my mouth when I read them aloud, like I've spoken them before, maybe in sleep. The dreams started simple enough. I was lying in bed, the same bed I sleep in every night, but there was this light. Just a small thing, really, oval-shaped, hanging somewhere above me like a pale moon that had drifted too close to Earth. It pulsed gently, rhythmic as breathing, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my ceiling had developed a skylight I'd never noticed before. When I woke up, I checked, no skylight, just the familiar popcorn texture of drywall, painted that neutral beige I'd chosen because it was safe, unremarkable. Work had been stressful lately, that's what I told myself. Stress manifests in odd ways, creates phantom lights in dream bedrooms, makes you notice things that aren't there. The mind plays tricks when it's overloaded. But the dream came back. The second time I stayed longer in that space between sleeping and waking. The oval light was still there, still breathing its soft pulse, but now I could hear something underneath it. A constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly. More like the sound of electricity moving through walls, but cleaner somehow, more purposeful. I tried to move in the dream, to turn my head and see where the humming originated, but my body felt heavy, disconnected. I could think clearly, could observe everything happening around me, but I was anchored to the bed by some invisible weight. The light grew slightly brighter as I struggled, and I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. There was a voice then, metallic and distant, speaking words I couldn't quite grasp. The syllables felt important, like instructions I should remember, but they slipped away even as I heard them. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the light itself, from the walls, from inside my own head. I woke up gasping. That morning I found the plate on my kitchen counter. Clean white ceramic, sitting there like it belonged, though I was certain I'd put all the dishes away the night before. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. It was warm to the touch, as if someone had just finished using it, but there were no crumbs, no water spots, no evidence of food or washing. I put it back in the cabinet and tried to forget about it. The refrigerator was making a different sound too, still humming at what seemed like the expected decibel level, but the pitch was wrong somehow. Higher than usual, more insistent. When I opened the door to check, everything looked normal. Milk, eggs, leftover pasta in a clear container. But as I stood there in the cool wash of artificial air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, or maybe something extra had been added. The inventory felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what had changed. I started keeping a list after that, every item in my refrigerator, counted and recorded each morning. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, a way to anchor myself to concrete reality when my dreams were becoming so vivid they left physical sensations lingering into daylight hours. The third dream was different, longer, more real than the waking world I returned to afterward. I was in the same position, lying in bed beneath that oval light, but now I could smell something. Sharp and clean, like ozone after a storm, but more artificial. It filled my lungs with each breath, and I noticed that my breathing had synchronized with the pulsing of the light above me. In pulse, out pulse, in pulse, out pulse. The metallic voice was clearer this time, though still speaking in that language I couldn't understand. But understanding felt less important than listening. The words washed over me like warm water, and I found myself relaxing into them, letting them carry me deeper into whatever space I occupied. Time moved strangely in that place. I felt like I'd been lying there for hours, watching the light breathe, listening to the voice, but I also felt like I'd just arrived. Past and present folded together until I couldn't tell if this was the beginning or the end of something that had been happening for a very long time. The ceiling fan began to turn, though I was certain it had been off. The blades moved slowly, almost lazily, stirring the ozone-scented air. I watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, creating patterns that seemed meaningful, like a code I should be able to crack if I just focused hard enough. Then I felt the lifting sensation again, stronger this time. Not just the feeling of being lifted, but actually rising, floating up toward the breathing light. My body remained motionless on the bed below me, but some other part of me was ascending, drawn upward by invisible hands or forces I couldn't name. I woke up on the floor. Not beside my bed, not tangled in fallen sheets, but in the hallway, lying on carpet that showed fresh vacuum lines in neat, uniform rows. My body was positioned exactly as it had been in the dream, arms at my sides, legs straight, face turned upward toward the ceiling. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been, and I could still smell that sharp, artificial scent lingering in my nostrils. I stood up slowly, checking for injuries, for some explanation of how I'd ended up there. No bruises, no pain, but there was a small mark on my forearm, perfectly round, about the size of a pencil eraser, slightly raised like a mosquito bite, but without the itch. When I touched it, the skin felt warm and slightly numb. The mark was still there the next morning, and the morning after that. I started having trouble sleeping, not because I was afraid of the dreams exactly, but because the line between dreaming and waking was becoming harder to identify. I'd lie in bed, eyes closed, and hear that constant hum even when I was certain I was awake. I'd see flashes of oval light behind my eyelids, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. During the day, I'd catch myself listening for the metallic voice, straining to hear those almost familiar syllables in the white noise of air conditioning and distant traffic. Electronics began behaving strangely around me. My phone would flicker and display screens I'd never seen before, showing symbols instead of letters, numbers that counted in sequences I didn't recognize. The television would turn itself on in the middle of the night, broadcasting static that seemed to contain patterns, messages hidden in the visual snow. I'd stand in front of it, watching the random pixels dance, and feel like I was on the verge of understanding something crucial. My reflection started looking unfamiliar, not dramatically different, nothing anyone else would notice, but wrong in small ways. My eyes seemed slightly larger, or maybe the pupils were more dilated. My skin had a pallor that makeup couldn't quite correct. When I smiled, testing whether I still looked like myself, the expression felt forced, like I was remembering how to arrange my facial muscles rather than naturally expressing emotion. I went back to the inventory list, expanding it beyond just the refrigerator. Every object in my house cataloged and accounted for, but items kept appearing that I couldn't remember buying. Small things easily overlooked. A pen with unusual markings along the barrel, a coffee mug with a logo I didn't recognize, a book on my shelf that I was certain I'd never seen before, though when I opened it, I found passages highlighted in my own handwriting. The book was about sleep disorders, about the thin boundary between conscious and unconscious experience. The highlighted sections discussed false awakening, lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, but also stranger phenomena, cases of people who claimed to have experiences during sleep that left physical evidence, unexplained marks, missing time, knowledge they shouldn't possess. One passage was marked heavily, the margins filled with notes in my handwriting. The subject reported recurring dreams of examination by unknown entities. Upon awakening, small puncture wounds were discovered on the subject's extremities, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Medical evaluation could not determine the cause or method of creation. I didn't remember reading those words. I didn't remember writing those notes. The fourth dream felt like coming home. I was back under the oval light, breathing that clean, artificial air, listening to the metallic voice speak its incomprehensible instructions. But this time I wasn't alone. There were others around me, lying on similar surfaces, all of us arranged in neat rows like specimens in a collection. I couldn't turn my head to see them clearly, but I could sense their presence, could hear the synchronized rhythm of their breathing matching mine. We were all part of something larger, some process or procedure that required our participation, but not our understanding. The voice was speaking directly to me now, and though I still couldn't translate the words, I found myself responding. Not with my voice, which remained as paralyzed as the rest of my body, but with some other form of communication. Thoughts, maybe, or intentions broadcast directly from my mind to whatever presence controlled the light. I was answering questions I didn't consciously hear, providing information I didn't know I possessed. The exchange felt familiar, like a conversation I'd had many times before, a routine check-in or status report. When I woke up, I was in my bed, but the sheets were tucked around me with hospital corner precision. The kind of tight, neat arrangement I'd never been able to achieve myself, no matter how carefully I tried. My clothes were different too. The same style and color as what I'd worn to bed, but somehow cleaner, pressed, arranged on my body with the same mechanical precision as the bed sheets. The round mark on my forearm had been joined by others, 3 more, arranged in a perfect triangle, each one the same size and temperature as the first. I called in sick to work that day, then spent hours staring at myself in the bathroom mirror, looking for other changes, other evidence of whatever was happening to me during those lost hours between sleeping and waking. The reflection that stared back seemed more familiar now, as if I was finally seeing myself clearly after months of looking at a stranger. My pupils were definitely larger, not dilated from medication or bright lights, but naturally wider, as if they'd been adjusted to gather more information from whatever environments I was visiting in my sleep. When I blinked, the motion felt deliberate rather than automatic, like I was consciously controlling each flutter of my eyelids. I started staying awake. Coffee, cold showers, bright lights, anything to keep myself anchored in the waking world, but consciousness became increasingly difficult to maintain. I'd be sitting at my kitchen table, fully alert, and suddenly find myself lying in bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes, leaving gaps in my awareness that I couldn't account for. The house itself seemed to be participating in whatever was happening. I'd hear footsteps in empty rooms, see shadows moving past windows when I was certain I was alone. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation even when the power was turned off, stirring air that carried that familiar ozone scent. The refrigerator hummed its new frequency constantly now, and when I checked my inventory list, I found items that definitely hadn't been there before. Foods I didn't recognize, packaged in containers with labels I couldn't read. When I tried to photograph them with my phone, the camera malfunctioned, producing images that were either completely black or filled with the same visual static I'd been seeing on my television. I threw the strange items away, but they reappeared the next morning, arranged in exactly the same positions on the shelves. The dreams were coming every night now, sometimes multiple times in a single sleep cycle. I'd wake up, check the surroundings, confirm that I was in my own bed in my own house, then close my eyes and immediately find myself back under the oval light, back in that sterile space where the metallic voice continued its patient questioning. The conversations were becoming more complex, more detailed. I was providing information about my daily routine, my thoughts, my reactions to the changes happening in my body and my environment. The presence behind the voice seemed pleased with my responses, satisfied with whatever data I was providing. But satisfaction felt mutual. Despite the strangeness, despite the growing disconnection from what I'd previously considered normal life, I felt useful, important, like I was contributing to something significant, something that required my specific participation. The marks on my skin multiplied into precise geometric patterns, just like the passage I'd found highlighted in that mysterious book. Triangles, circles, straight lines arranged in configurations that hurt to look at directly but felt meaningful in my peripheral vision. When I traced them with my fingertip, they were warm and slightly raised, like brands that had been applied with careful attention to symmetry and spacing. I stopped trying to stay awake. Instead, I began preparing for sleep with the same methodical care I'd once reserved for important appointments. Clean sheets, comfortable clothes, everything arranged to facilitate whatever process was occurring during those lost hours. The dreams began to feel more real than waking life. Under the oval light, breathing that clean air, I felt more like myself than I did during the increasingly disconnected daylight hours. The metallic voice had become familiar, almost comforting, like a friend I'd known for years, but only met in that specific place. Other voices joined the conversation sometimes, different tones, different patterns of speech, but all using the same incomprehensible language that I was somehow beginning to understand. Not the individual words, but the intent behind them, the emotional content that transcended specific vocabulary. They were teaching me something, or maybe extracting something. The distinction seemed less important than the process itself, the gradual transformation that was occurring in both my sleeping and waking states. My reflection had stabilized into something I recognized as definitively myself, but a better version. More alert, more purposeful, more connected to whatever larger system I was becoming part of. The pale skin and enlarged pupils no longer looked wrong, just different, adapted for new requirements. I started the inventory reports without consciously deciding to do so. Clean, precise documentation of everything in my environment, noting changes and anomalies with the same methodical attention I'd been receiving under the oval light. The reports felt important, necessary, like a responsibility I'd been trained to fulfill. The house continued its subtle transformations. Furniture moved slightly each day, repositioning itself in arrangements that were more efficient, more purposeful than my original decorating choices. The ceiling fan maintained its slow rotation, and I found myself timing my breathing to match the rhythm of its blades. Electronics throughout the house synchronized to the same frequency, humming together in harmony. The sound was no longer strange or intrusive, just part of the environment, like the buzz of fluorescent lights in a place where important work was being conducted. Last night I had the dream again. The same bed, the same oval light pulsing with mechanical breath, the same metallic voice speaking its patient questions. But when I woke up this morning, something was different. I'm not in my house anymore. The bed is the same, the sheets tucked with that familiar hospital corner precision. The ceiling fan rotates slowly overhead, stirring air that carries the clean scent of ozone, but the walls are different, smoother. The light coming through the window has a quality I don't recognize, too bright and too uniform to be natural sunlight. I'm not afraid, I should be, but the emotion feels irrelevant, like a response designed for a previous version of myself that no longer applies to current circumstances. The inventory report is on the nightstand beside me, typed on clean white paper in my careful handwriting. I pick it up and read the familiar words, noting that everything is exactly as it should be. All windows latched securely, furniture placement untouched, the calendar marking dates without additional notation. In the kitchen, I find the single plate on the countertop, warm and clean and waiting for whatever purpose it serves. The refrigerator hums at the expected frequency, and when I check the contents, everything matches the inventory perfectly. The hallway carpet shows fresh vacuum lines, uniform and precise. The air is the right temperature now, no longer too cold, adjusted to optimal comfort levels. I walk to the bathroom and look at myself in the mirror. The reflection shows someone I recognize completely, someone who belongs in this place, who serves a function I'm finally beginning to understand. The geometric marks on my skin pulse gently, synchronized with the breathing light I know is waiting for me when I return to sleep. They're not marks anymore, I realize. They're interfaces, connection points. Tonight, I'll lie down under the oval light and listen to the metallic voice ask its questions, and I'll provide the answers I've been trained to give. Tomorrow, I'll write another inventory report, documenting the small changes and adjustments that indicate the system is functioning as designed. The dreams were never dreams. They were orientations. And now the real work begins.